Chinese Exclusion Act. And really for the next 50, 60 years, there was virtually no immigration from Asia into this country. So their thanks for their hard work was almost a century of exclusion from this country. So today, and with this historic gathering, it is appropriate to recognize the accomplishments that our community has achieved over the past 120 years, and also acknowledge that we still have a long way to go. And that has been one of my priorities at the Obama administration. It is one of my priorities as the former co-chair of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And in that role, we focused on two main priority areas. Number one, we disaggregated data. Now, I know that sounds a little wonky, but what that means is that unless you know the problems in our community, you can't begin to solve them. So prior to this, most federal agencies simply collected data based on African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans. But they didn't start to talk about Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans. And when you disaggregate the data, you start to see the disparities within our community, particularly among Hmong immigrants, Southeast Asian immigrants, even among Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. The second important priority that we made was to ensure that federal services were targeted to people in the Asian American community. All of you recall back in 2010 when we had an horrible oil spill in the Gulf Coast. The people who were disproportionately affected by that oil spill were fishermen and shrimpers, largely from Southeast Asia. And while the federal government had an all-hands-on-deck approach to providing services to the affected people in the Gulf Coast, people didn't think initially about how do we make sure that vulnerable communities who might not have proficiency in English, might not have familiarity with federal services, could access that. So we, as the Obama administration, sent down people who had the language skills and had the cultural familiarity to ensure that the people most affected by the oil spill could receive the services. So that's just one small example of how we have helped to ensure that the federal government is more responsive to our community. But we understand that despite the great gains of our community, and when I say community, I mean Asian Americans, there are still great problems that lie within our community. Poverty. While we are on balance the wealthiest racial group of any racial group in the country, there are still deep pockets of despair within our community. When you look among Cambodian Americans, Laotian Americans, Vietnamese Americans, you have poverty rates that are well in excess of 20%. Even among Chinese Americans, when you go to a place like New York's Chinatown, you see 40% of Chinese American children living in poverty. Think about health care. Prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, we still had a significant number of people in our community that lacked health care. And you might have seen the statistic, because of the President's brave action, the level of uninsured in this country is now at a record low. Yet, despite those gains, we know that Asian Americans continue to have one of the highest rates of hepatitis B. We actually have one of the highest rates of HIV/AIDS infection, and there are still large segments within our group that are not receiving the preventive care that they need. So that's poverty, that's healthcare. Let's talk about education. While we spend a lot of time in our community lamenting whether we're getting the colleges that we should be getting into, it is important to understand that 40% of Asian American young people attend community colleges. We also need to be cognizant of the fact that within our community we have large populations that are high school graduates. I was stunned to realize that 38% of Laotian Americans, 40% of Hmong Americans are high school graduates, high school dropouts. And so while we spend a lot of time, and rightfully we spend a lot of time thinking about elite universities, we need to understand that that does not represent the entire Asian American community. So we have made great progress over the last 125 years. We have a long way to go. And one of the ways that we solve these problems is by staying engaged in the civic process. And I know that's been a constant theme of this convention, and I will echo everything that everyone has already said along the way. You know, one of the favorite things that I get to do as the Deputy Secretary of Labor is swear in new citizens. Last year, I was at Oakton High School, which is out in Fairfax, Virginia, about a half hour from here. And I did a swearing in ceremony 3 days before Christmas. And at that ceremony, I swore in 500 citizens from 86 countries. And if any of you have been to a naturalization ceremony, if any of you recall when you were naturalized, you recall that they do a roll call of countries from where the new citizens came from. And it literally goes A to Z, Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. And what you see in that is what makes our country so wonderful. You see the cheering families, you see the sense of civic pride, you see the desire to contribute to this country. And what I say when I go and speak to those new immigrant groups is that the most important thing you can do as a citizen is start to get engaged in the political process. And I'm not here to do politics. I'm here in my official capacity. But what I will say is all of this, which is there's far too much ugliness in our politics. There's far too much name calling in our politics. There's far too much divisions. There's far too much pitting one group against another, one racial group against another, Americans that were born here versus Americans who are immigrants. And what I'm here to say is that we don't have to have that as our politics. All of us can change the tenure in this country. All of us can change the direction of the policies in our country. And that's upon all of us. And so whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a Republican, you're an independent, it is critical for all of us to have a role in the political process. And the very first thing you do is you register to vote. And all of you have probably heard this multiple times during this conference, which is that Asian Americans have one of the lowest rates of voter registration of any minority group. And even when we register to vote, we have a disproportionately low number of people that come out to vote. And so each of us can think about things that are going well in our country. Each of us can think about many things that are not going well in the country. Each of us can think about areas where government could serve us better. But the one way that we help solve those problems is by registering our vote. You know, the president earlier in this year spoke to this. He said this: whatever you may believe, whether you prefer one party or no party, our collective future depends on your willingness to uphold your obligations as a citizen, to vote, to speak out, to stand up for others, especially the weak, especially the vulnerable, knowing that each of us is only here because somebody somewhere stood up for us. To stay active in our public life reflects the goodness and decency and optimism that I see in the American people every day. So regardless of whether you agree with the policies of this president, regardless of where you stand in the presidential election, make sure that you exercise the most important right that we have as U.S. citizens. Because for far too long, Asian Americans, Chinese Americans have sat on the sidelines of politics. Now, at first we used to say, well, our numbers weren't very big, so there's no way we can influence the healthcare policies, the education policies, the poverty policies of our country. But we can't make that excuse anymore. Our numbers have grown, and as all of you know, Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in this country right now. And so we deserve to have a voice in the political process. The number of voters who are immigrants or US-born children of immigrants has grown dramatically in the past couple of decades. Just among Asian American and Pacific Islanders, the number of registered voters has increased by 10 million since 1996. So the key is to ensure that we do all we can to get people to the polls. But that's not the only thing. We know that there are obstacles standing in the way of people who exercise their right to vote. For some people, it could be a lack of English translations of ballots. For other places, and unfortunately in far too many states, there are restrictive laws on voting, requiring people to have difficult voter IDs that are difficult to manage. All of these are challenges that, whether you are an African American, whether you're Latino American, whether you're Asian American, affect all of our communities. So what I'm here to say to all of you is that we are in a period of incredible division in this country. We are at a crossroads in our country in terms of what the policies we want to go forward on and the policies that will affect us as a community. The most important thing you can do on behalf of Chinese Americans, on behalf of Americans, is to go out and use your voice to be heard. And then once you get past that, consider other ways you can be involved in your public life. Consider running for office. Consider serving on local boards and advisory groups. Consider spending some time with the disadvantaged groups within our community. Each of us is here in this country because somebody else took a chance on us, because someone else lent us a hand when we needed it. And it's our obligation as Chinese Americans and Asian Americans to lend that hand to others. Congratulations on this inaugural conference. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to following the progress of this remarkable organization. Thank you.